Geography is not emphasized much in our education system in America these days, but geography and history they go hand in hand. Geography, I mean, I remember noticing when I was a kid how much our geography lessons seem to overlap with our history lessons. In the case of China, they have mountains and deserts that isolate them from the rest of humanity. To the north is the big Gobi Desert. To the west is the land of Tibet, which is one of the drier places on Earth. To the north of the Chinese lived the Mongolians, and they were in constant competition with their Mongolian neighbors. Now, to keep these peoples out, they built the Great Wall, and the Great Wall is still standing. The Great Wall is one of the wonders of the world. It has been said that the Great Wall is the only thing made by man that can be seen from the moon. Well, that is not true. It would be true if the Great Wall were as wide as it is long, but it is not. It's long and narrow, so being so narrow, it can't be seen from the moon. But it is long enough to where it could be seen if it were, again, if it were solidly as wide as it's long. Now, folk, here's a problem the Chinese had. One reason they built the wall was these nomadic Mongolians would come in, sneak into the community, and steal their children, oftentimes their wives, take everything they had. Before the Chinese army would move in, these Mongolians would have disappeared and scattered out all over Mongolia, and the Chinese would have a difficult time, almost an impossible time chasing them. I had a student write a paper at another college once how the Chinese should have instead built a trained army. And I tried to tell him, hey, you're thinking in terms of 21st century America. In the 21st century, we have airplanes, helicopters, radios, GPSs, and we could track these people if they tried something like that. In the world that I'm talking about here, the army could not be every place at once. And these people would figure out where the army was and then just simply jump in where the army wasn't, steal what they wanted and leave. So the wall was like a solution to the problem. If the people breached the wall and got in, all the army had to do was seal up the wall again. And that way the Mongolian people would be trapped inside of China. These people had the tendency to locate their civilizations along the banks of rivers. The two main rivers were the Yellow and Yangtze River. Some of you might be aware we have a river called the Yellow River right here nearby in Metro Atlanta. It's nothing compared to the Chinese Yellow River, but it's called yellow because at certain places along the river, the water turns yellow because of a certain type of plant life that's nearby. But in China, they have two big rivers. The ancient Chinese organized themselves along the lines of extended families, and they still do to some extent. If you have the same great-great-grandparents, you're considered part of the same family. The family reorganized itself, when it becomes another generation after the generation of the great-great-grandparents. But if you have the same great-great-grandparents, you're part of the extended family or a clan. One of the reasons the Chinese have grown rice from earliest times, any of you know anything about rice, it requires an extensive amount of work, and it requires the cooperation of the whole community. I've heard a lot about rice growing. I never have seen it done. I mean, I understand they do grow rice in places in Georgia and South Carolina on the coast, and it requires that the rice plants be planted underwater. So much water to work them, you have to actually wade out in the water and run a risk of being attacked by snakes, leeches, and all kinds of other unpleasant stuff. And a lot of people do not like working it. But it requires a lot of work and the cooperation of the whole community. So families had to work together out of necessity. The Chinese language is ideographical. In other words, instead of writing letters, they write ideas, simplified ideas. And each symbol stands for a whole word, not just one letter, but a whole word. And there are thousands of symbols, which makes the language difficult for Westerners to learn. recently someone figured out how to write the Chinese language using an ordinary computer with English letters on top. Just get the right combination of letters that would print a Chinese ideograph. And he wrote it and it became the standard among Chinese. Of all the civilization we're going to study, the Chinese is the only one that survived intact until the 20th century. Now, in 1949, China abandoned Confucianism and adopted communism. So you can't say it survived intact to this day, but it did survive intact till the 20th century. Egypt, no, they didn't survive intact. They abandoned their gods for Christianity, and then they became Islamic later. Same with the Middle East. They changed over to Islam. But the Chinese, they kept the same civilization up until around 1949 when they embraced communism. Now, the three sovereigns are not considered serious history. Your book mentions them, so I will. And the three sovereigns, by the way, do have a name, but they are supposedly the ones who gave China their civilization. If you look on a map of ethnic peoples and where they came from, the Chinese people are believed to have come from the area around Egypt and passed through on their way to China, passed through the southern Arabia, the area around Mount Sinai. The word China comes from Sinite or Sinite. And you'll find references to Sine on places along the way. Mount Sinai, for instance, was probably one of their stopping places. Eventually, though, they spread on east and found a nice, rich, fertile land in what is today China. They divide their histories much like Egyptians do according to their dynasties. Except with Egypt, the dynasties are called First Dynasty, Second Dynasty, Third Dynasty. Among the Chinese, their dynasties are named. Now, the Xia dynasty, the first one, it's not really considered serious history by modern standards of record keeping. Now, folks, I want to say this about these old fables and legends, and I'll be repeating this. I mean, Great Britain begins its history with, among other things, stories of a king named Arthur. And King Arthur is often associated with a whole lot of magical deeds and magical swords and fairies and whatever. All your ancient peoples began their history with stories that we today would call mythology or legend. Stories that we today cannot believe or tend to not believe. China is no exception. They begin their history with what we call fairy tales. I remember, when I was here's the story that I was told one time when I was younger, that there's three beginnings to fairy tales. Fairy tales begin with once upon a time, where it begins with long ago and far away. The third beginning is back when I was in the Army. Anyway, that was told to me by a sergeant when I was in the Army. And fairy tales often have a certain type of ending. And they lived happily ever after. I saw a cartoon one time where this daddy was reading a book to his young daughter, and it ended, and they lived happily ever after on Social Security. It was a book of fairy tales. In other words, yes, I collect Social Security, but I was also here, and may be here for a while. Anyway, all right. But they began their history. Now, again, on a personal note, I mean, I don't talk about religion, my own personal religion, but one time I was talking to a Chinese man about Christianity. He said, this sounds like what we call fairy tales. And so we begin our history with the same type of stories. Yes, every group does. Dragon stories and stories we call fairy tales. And one of the papers I've assigned to you as a possible topic is how much attention should we pay to these ancient mythologies? And I meant to make a speech about that. I'll make it now. In Greek mythology, they say that Venus popped out of the head of Jupiter and became a full-grown woman when she was born by popping out of the head of Jupiter. This might be based on some people believe the planet Venus actually once was a moon of either Jupiter or Saturn's, and it broke away when some passing exploded star, parts of fragments went through our solar system and tilted Uranus on its side, exploded a planet between Mars and Jupiter, and broke Venus away from its parent planet. And the ancients saw Venus break away from its parent planet, so they said, well, in other words, it was based on an actual observation. Another thing, the stories of the Iliad and Odyssey was based around the city of Troy. Well, at one time we said Troy it doesn't exist, we never found it. Then we found the city of Troy and found out the last time it was inhabited, it was burned. So some of these mythologies, folk, I think should be taken seriously. The ancients were trying to tell something to moderns that we simply do not believe. But they had, so one person put it this way, that the mythologies are a secret coded message sent from the ancients to the wise people of the future, and in the future only the wise will be able to discern it and understand it. Believe what you will, folk. But all people begin their histories with stories that we today just don't accept as real. Now, we know this about the first dynasty that we consider historical is the Shang. We have found the palace of their kings, so that's what makes them historical. I mean, the fact that we found something that belonged to them. We do know that they used bones to determine the will of the gods. Now, here was the logic behind it, folks. They believed that that the gods communicated their will through animals. And if they opened up animals and looked at the color of their intestines or the color of their bones, they could determine what the gods were thinking or which direction the gods were directing them. In other words, this king would wonder, well, should I undertake this big, expensive military campaign or not? So he'd have some of his shamans or some of his priests open up a certain type of animal, and they would study the bones, and then the priest would determine, well, the bones are of this color, you'd better not go, Your Majesty, or the bones are of that color. Yes, it's okay to go. If you go, you'll win. This seems primitive to us. However, I mean, I have read persons who say that some of this stuff may actually have some kind of validity. For instance, if you see a snake crawling on the ground when the temperature outside is freezing and this snake is slithering along icy ground, you can pretty well guess an earthquake is about to happen. Because snakes would stay underground when it's cold. But they will come out of the ground only if they know, because they can sense the rumblings deep inside the earth before we do. And they know earthquakes, so they'll be crushed by the earthquake, so they'll actually come out in the freezing weather and run a risk of freezing to death. And the Indians used to be able to tell when the enemy was near by listening to the birds. The birds would chirp a certain way if somebody was near that shouldn't be, if they would chirp one way or they chirped another. The Indians would listen to the sound of the bird chirpings to try to determine, is there deer nearby for me to hunt, or is there an enemy nearby? And they could tell whether they were alone or not. Anyway, then came along the Zhou dynasty. Now, one of these dynasties, and I forget which one, maybe one of you will know, one of these dynasties that was buried with about thousands of terracotta figures, all that were life-size, 6 foot tall on average. And these terracotta figures were actually brought to Atlanta at one point and displayed in our Civic Center. No, I never went to see them, but basically this emperor believed that by making these terracotta figures and burying them with him, it was like he was taking his army with him into the next life. What's that? The Chu dynasty?
The Qin.
Qin. Okay, then that's a little bit later. All right, I think that's a little bit later. Anyway, there was the Zhou dynasty, and they lasted about 900 years, the longest in Chinese history. Now, the problem with these dynasties, they would start off with a wise, capable ruler, and they would live long enough to pass the throne to their son. But eventually, inevitably, they became corrupted as time went on. They developed sometimes a weak son, or sometimes a very sickly king would come to the throne, but he'd get the throne because he had the right to it, being first in line for it. And eventually, the dynasty will be overthrown. The well-field system, that allowed peasants to own plots to own land, or they'd have a field, not next to a river necessarily, but they'd have a field, and to get the water they needed, they would dig a well. And folk, I mean, you can believe what I did some research on this, but all ancient peoples, and this is being done even as I speak in modern times, some people seem to have a gift for being able to determine where the water is by using a divining rod, which looks like a glorified wishbone. It's where two branches come together and form a shape of a Y. And if they can feel the water, they say, drill a hole here, and you drill a hole there, and there's water there. Other persons have been skeptical and say, oh, you can drill a hole anywhere, and you'll always run into water. Be that as it may, some people believe that they can use divining. It's called a divining rod. Determine, how many of you have heard of this? Okay, again, you can believe what you want to. I know when my dad drilled a well, the driller used a divining rod and determined, yeah, there's a vein right here, and drilled down, and sure enough, he found the vein. 99% of the time, it appears to work. But again, does this mean that there's really water all over the place on the ground, or do these people actually have the ability to determine? But anyway, peasants could have plots of their own because they learned how to drill for water deep down. They believed the best government was the benevolent monarchy, and this is going to sound a lot like Plato and Socrates, who we'll talk about later. Oftentimes, though, but the benevolent monarchy degenerated to factions with a bunch of despotic local rulers who exploited people. Folk, my views of government and my views of a lot of things changed a lot after I spent 5 years teaching in a public school. I mean, when I was in college, having never really been exposed to the real world except as a student, I thought, you know, if I could be a ruler, I would be so great and so just and so wise, I know just what to do. Then I got my own classroom of elementary school students and realized, hey, I understand better what sometimes makes a ruler into a despot, or into a lot of times it's the people he's ruling over making that way. He starts out kind and gentle, and he's taken advantage of, and after a while he feels like, hey, I've got to become as mean as a snake in order to survive. Once you've been out in the real, if you ever become a supervisor of a department, or ever become a school teacher yourself, of elementary or high school student, maybe you'll understand better what I'm talking about. Today's public schools are beyond, I'm going to talk about American public schools, are beyond repair. They can't be fixed. So, I had a student report me for saying that. Of course, I've been told my president department, I can say what I want to. Believe me, I'm careful a little bit. When I say that American schools cannot be fixed, if you know of a way to fix them, well, I think one way that might actually work is if we split them up and put them say the 1 or 2 room old-fashioned brick schoolhouse where each little bitty neighborhood had its own 1-room school. And each teacher then was the principal and would be in charge of the absolute control of that school. Maybe that would work. Get a bunch of kids together and they take charge. All right. Now, eventually, though, they developed a fair, uniform system of taxation. They developed iron. They also developed plowshares where the horses were using collar harnesses. It was shoulder harness instead of neck harnesses. Believe it or not, at one time, mankind would put a harness around a horse's neck, and a horse would choke to death as he tried to pull a plow or something heavy. Then, hey, lower that harness to the horse's shoulders, and he can pull a lot more weight. It sounds pretty basic, but it took mankind hundreds of years. Now, natural fertilizers, that's another nice way of saying human waste. The Chinese used human waste in their crops, and yes, it did make for some really good growing crops. Other peoples have shunned the idea, but yeah, natural fertilizers. And they also learned to let some of the land lie fallow for a year to get minerals back into the soil. Now, that's not as necessary as it once was because of today's use of fertilizers. but it's still known that sometimes land will produce better. It's just simply you don't farm it for a year, farm it for a few years and quit farming, then farm it again and do better. All right, I should have opened up with this statement. I want to say this about the Chinese. Except for possibly the Sumerians, who made a lot. The Chinese were the most inventive and creative people on the face of the earth up until the year 1500. What did they invent? I mean, they invented steel, they invented the shoulder harness for horses, they invented the rudder, they invented the movable sail for their ships, they invented paper, they set up a banking system, they invented paper money, they learned how to use cotton, silk, what all else? Oh yeah, the printing press. Gunpowder, yes. The inventions they made, folks, should have enabled them to take over and conquer the world. They simply didn't. Their inventions carried so far. I mean, hey, but with the printing press, you might begin to realize how important it is. Without the printing press, you cannot have, all right, well, like these books that we're using as textbooks, it would take an individual author maybe 6 months to print one up. If you can imagine a man hand printing. With today's technology, you can print out 100,000 of them in a matter of maybe a day or two. Because, again, the printing press enables knowledge to be cheaply disseminated all over the realm. Their inventions should have, about paper money and banking. Without banking, you cannot have a complex economy. All of us will probably, if we haven't already, have to deal with banks at one point or another. Banks will buy your cars for you, buy your houses for you. Without the bank, most of us would find it impossible to buy a car or a house because while we're paying rent, we can't save up enough money to make our own house payment. Whereas, I mean, to afford to pay the full price for a house, whereas the bank, they can loan us the money. Again, banks, paper money. Without paper money, you cannot have a complex economy. I mean, imagine Lockheed trying to pay its workers in gold and silver coins. I mean, they'd say, everybody line up, it's payday, and you'd line up, and they'd start distributing the gold and silver coins. It would take maybe a day, 3 or 4 days. Well, they could never get any work done. As it is, Lockheed would pay its workers by simply making electronic entrance into a computer, and the computer would send it to the bank. And it was that simple, and it took nobody much at any time except for a few people at the bank and a few people at Lockheed, at Paymaster. But, again, the world we have today could not exist without some of these things they invented should have carried them to the top. As for gunpowder, they wound up giving that to the Mongolians, then the Muslims got a hold of it, and then the Europeans, and they made better guns and the better use of gunpowder than the Chinese ever did. Anyway, the Qin dynasty, okay, they began to build the Great Wall, which still stands. The first Qin emperor's burial mound had these, I call it terracotta, yes, terracotta figures. They used ceramics. They began to use metal casting. Like the Egyptians, they spent a lot of time and money preparing the king for a happy afterlife. Then came the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was founded by Wang Mang. Now, I've just noticed this morning when I was looking at some of the work that I've had you read, particularly my own work about comparative civilizations, I make a remark that China did not do a lot for its poor. That's not as true. In fact, I really should change it. A lot of Chinese emperors did try to help the poor. Among the Indians, you can't find hardly any case where they did, but among the Chinese, some of the Chinese emperors did try to help the poor, but eventually all of their attempts failed. It seems like you're going to have poor no matter what you try to do to help them. If you give them everything, they wind up expecting it to become dependent. Socialism is a prime example. They invented the rudder, fore and aft rigging. Your sails would have the front and back sail rigging to where the sails could be moved. Now, any of you know anything about sailboating? If the wind is blowing this way and you want to go this way, Anybody have to know how you do it? It can be done. Essentially, you zigzag your boat. You turn your boat this way and point the sail like this way. The sail will grab the wind, then you go zig and then zag and zig and zag. And you can actually zig and zag against the wind. Again, by simply moving the sails and positioning your boat. They learned how to do this. There they invented paper. Their houses, we know of, were simple, and most did not have a whole lot of stuff in them. Their dress, generally simple, utilitarian. As was the case of the people of India, they originally believed in a god called Shangdi, and this D you'll find in Dios, Deus. That was India, Dios, Spanish. Some people believe that this was the original name that a lot of people gave the original God that mankind may have once worshipped, original monotheism. Now again, some people will dispute that and say that there's no evidence of it. Folk, you can find evidence for anything there is. So when somebody says there is no evidence, I scratch it. Also, someone else pointed out the absence of evidence does not mean the evidence of absence. Like in a case that, well, Troy doesn't exist because we haven't found it yet. Then we find it. Now, they once believed in a transcendent God who presided over everything. Then they came to believe in heaven. Now, here is the difference between China and European in regard to the religion. Europeans worshipped a God who had a name. The Chinese tended to worship heaven. In other words, the emperor came about because heaven chose him. Notice it's an impersonal, no definite name assigned to him, it's just heaven chose him. Then, after 2 or 3 generations, heaven might reject one of his descendants for being bad. Then heaven would appoint a new God. In other words, it wasn't a person. Heaven seemed to have nobody in charge. It was just a big conglomeration of spirit beings who got together and presided over the affairs of men. Very impersonal. Unlike the Europeans and other peoples who worshipped a God they could name, Chinese did not. Now, Yang and Yin, 2 opposite forces, and they believed that this made up the whole cosmos. Now, they went so far as in their medicine, and some of them still do this, they believed that if you got the Yang and Yin in balance, a person would be well. Sickness was brought about when one of these 2 forces got out of balance. Now, again, a lot of today's Western doctors will look at a person who's feeling bad and study his body chemistry and say, oops, you're low on sugar, or you're low on thyroid. Or you got too much sugar in your system. You need to eat less sugar. You need to eat more sugar. You need to take in more iron. You have an iron deficiency. Yin and Yang reminds me somewhat of electricity, which, if you know anything about it, it consists of positive and negative. Positive, negative, and when the positive puts pressure on a negative, there's a current flow. It goes around from positive or from negative to positive. And magnetism, North Pole and South Pole. You have a north and a south. And all of you may know that if you touch a north end of a magnet to another north end, the magnets will repel each other. Touch a north to a south, they'll attract. Same with electricity. Positive to positive, they repel. Positive to negative, they attract. Try to hook 2 positive poles of a car battery to a car, nothing will happen. You have to have both the positive and the negative in order for a circuit to work. And yes, I do a lot of dabbling in electronics, and I've had many a circuit of mine not work because maybe the positive side was not properly connected or the negative side wasn't connected. I had a radio put together and it didn't work. I thought, well, I'll start checking voltages, and found out it had 9 volts on every part of it, including the chassis. Oops. 9 volts on it. That means that the chassis is not connected to ground. So I connected the chassis to ground and everything clicked. It's easy to make that mistake, believe it or not. Now, They believed in inevitability of these two forces, and that led to what we notice as the fatalism that we find often in Chinese literature. The Greeks had a problem with this also. Fatalism is a belief that the cosmos controls everything and we are just helpless victims of the cosmos. What will be, and there is absolutely nothing we can do about it. Among Christians who believe in predestination, they often have this type of fatalism. I'm completely, totally in the hands of my Creator, and there's nothing I can do about any of my destiny. If I'm going to get sick, I will. Now again, don't get me wrong, folks. Believe me, I'm not trying to teach this or preach this or whatever you call it. I'm teaching about it. No, I do believe that humans can take and should take responsibility. And no, we're not necessarily helpless, predestined creatures, victims of the cosmos, whatever you call it. We have our own free will. But again, some people would really jump down my throat for saying that. Maybe you feel like doing it yourself. I don't know. But nevertheless, a lot of the Chinese people believe that we simply cannot help ourselves. We're completely at the mercy of forces. They developed a concept of Da, and there is no exact English word we can translate Da into. The most accurate word we can use is the word way. Every person has his own Da or his own way, individual way. Again, folks, there's a lot of truth in this and a lot of error in it also, depending on. Now, they believed that if you didn't perform rituals for a dying relative, that relative would come back as a ghost to haunt you. You had to make sure that your dead relative left this world and went to the next world. So you perform rituals to send your dead relative into the next world. They believed, again, that these parted spirits would sometimes not leave this world and would haunt you as ghosts. And I mean, I'm old enough to where a lot of my people that I've known while alive will come back to me in dreams. No, I've never been visited by a spirit who are dead. No, I never will be. But nevertheless, I mean, they believe that some of the dead would come back to haunt you if you did not practice the... Now, eventually, the number one religious leader they had was a man named Confucius. Unlike other philosophers, he emphasized the practical, the daily aspects of real living. And Confucius believed that everybody had his own Da, his own way of doing things. So if one person did things different from you, well, that's that person's Da. It's okay for him to do that, but it's not okay for you to do that because you have your own Da. And it was up to each person to find his own particular Da, or his own way of doing things. If you find yourself in harmony with the universe, you'd prosper. In other words, what was really important was the real practical aspects of daily living. Now, I want to say about Confucius. He's one of the world's religious founders, along with Buddha, Mohammed, Jesus, Moses, Zoroaster. Like a lot of the others, he was not recognized while he was alive. These men would try to get some nobleman, some rich person to sponsor them, and Confucius had the bad luck of he never could find steady employment. And he was not honored until after he was gone. Then after he had been gone a while, people began to realize, hey, this man really was great, we should honor him. He taught, among other things, compassion, something that Indian religions did not have. Now, he believed that government was a matter of the will of the people. Thomas Jefferson would have agreed with him, Ben Franklin would have agreed with him, George Washington would have agreed with him. I'm talking about some of the founders of our own country. Government was a matter of whether the people willed it, and that was a radical concept of the time. Now, as is the case of Buddha, and perhaps the case of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, we do not know if Confucius believed even that there was a God. Some people call his teaching a philosophy, some call it a religion. We don't know if he was a religious man at all. He simply emphasized the practical, the humane, the here and now, and placed very little emphasis on the afterlife. He believed that people should be appointed to government positions based on their ability, not because they were born into it. And this was one of the things that put China ahead of the rest of humanity. for a long time. The Chinese developed civil service tests. And a person would get a high position in government based on his performance on a test. Now, I had a student ask me, how do you know that a person who scores highly will be able to do well on a government position? You don't. But it was just assumed that a person who could score highly on a big government test might be a better leader than persons who couldn't. The idea was to get smart people in government positions and not just persons who were born firstborn or born into nobility. Mencius was one of Confucius' disciples. He taught, hey, government is basically good. If you can get the people on your side, you'll have a happy time of it. So then the government should give people what they like and not what they don't like. Again, folk, I mean, I can't give out a philosophy like this without commenting on it. Sometimes what the people think they want is what you know as the government is not the best for them. And you just simply realize you can't and shouldn't give them what they like. And like I said, I believe last class, some philosopher, and nobody knows who, said our American democracy will work until the common people find out they can dip their hand into the public pot. And our people are dipping their hand in the public pot right and left, and our democracy might be on the verge of collapsing. Be that as it may. Nevertheless, I mean, yeah, it sounds great. Give people what they like and they'll follow you. Legalism rejected Mencius. Legalism was a philosophy that says man is basically evil, and the only way you can have any kind of order is by firm, hard action of the state. That the idea was that we should have strict interpretation of the writings of one religion, and this was the only way that the government could keep the peace, is by strict enforcement of its laws and firm action, and holding everybody to account, holding a firm hand over them. And folk, again, I cannot determine which of these two men are right. I mean, they both have their good and their bad. Legalism as a term has been applied to Christians who had laws that are more strict than what is prescribed or enforce these laws are, and criticize others who do not abide by these made-up laws. These people tend to live alone or in small groups because they cannot get along with anybody and nobody can get along with them. All right, you may notice I could elaborate on that a little bit. Here's why, folks. On a very personal note, and I don't know how much my personal life I should get involved, but then again, how can I help it? I grew up under legalism. And one of the biggest comments, one of the biggest compliments one of my children gave to me one day was, we don't have any rules around here. Well, hey, I mean, I think I abide by a whole lot of life's rules. But I do so because I want to, not because I feel like I'm compelled to. There is a difference. I mean, two men were told one day that they had to stay late to do some work for the company. They both called their wives to tell them to be late. The one man called his wife because he wanted to. The other man called his wife because he had to. They both did the same thing, but there's a huge difference. The one man was free. The other man was in bondage. He was enslaved, entrapped, ensnared. There is a huge difference, folks. Do you keep life's rules because you like living that way, or you want to, or because you feel like there's some club held over you that's going to club you down if you don't keep them? I'll have more to say about this when we come to the chapter on Islam. Islam believes, and with all due respect to you who may be Islamic, it's the government's duty to enforce rules against drinking, against smoking, against gambling. I think these issues are better off if left to each individual to decide for himself or herself. Yes, I gamble as much as I want to. I play as many cards as I want to. I smoke as much tobacco as I want to. I drink as much alcohol as I want to. And I look at as much pornography as I want to. No, I don't want to do any of that stuff. Because these things get a hold of you and they won't let go. they'll grab you. Stay away from them. If you're starting to get involved in them, put them aside as quick as you can. They'll grab you. But again, it's up to each individual. I mean, in our country, we tried to outlaw drinking one time. We gave up on it. Today, we drink as much. Well, don't get me wrong. I mean, don't go out here and say, "There's country we can drink." Yeah, you can drink as much as you want to, but don't drive while you do so. And don't let it get control of you. Personally, I don't want to touch this stuff. I never have, and I never will. Actually, I suspect that I'm what I call a dry alcoholic. If I ever drink, it'll get over. How do I know that? Well, it's affected members of my family who have done it. So that's the one reason. Another reason is if you find yourself addicted to sweets, computer card games, or stuff like that, or in one failed relationship after another, you probably have an addiction problem. But again, it can be overcome. All right. But legalism, very bad. Now, Taoism. When I was a young man, I used to get Taoist letters trying to encourage me to embrace Taoism. I didn't. They believed that you could live a long life by proper sexual technique, meditation, and diet. I asked a Chinese man one time, do they really live 130 years? And he said, well, you never can find actual documentation to show when these people were born. But you go into a Taoist monastery, and they'll show you men that claim to be 120, 130 years old, and they look like they're in their 20s and 30s. Taoism claims to be a science, even though Western scientists would never call it true science. Essentially, Taoism simply is a matter of finding the right way, the right path. One thing I must say about Taoism too, because Confucianism is so lacking in any kind of spirituality. For instance, a mother who has lost her infant child cannot find any consolation in Confucius' writings. He simply did not deal with anything like that. Taoism is more spiritual. Taoism, in fact, has been called magic. And that's what led Europeans to believe that China was the land of magic, the land of the Tao. It's more spiritual, and the Chinese who want more spirituality than Confucius has to offer will often embrace Taoism. Taoism, though, did not offer much help to the bereaved or did not offer much assurance of a happy afterlife after death. Now, folks, this is something that hardly any of the ancient religions offered. You read Sumerian records where they went to the netherworld and they found that the people there lived on dust and ate clay, and they dressed in dirty, filthy rags. There was nothing to look forward to. You go to the Greek, and the Greeks believed that their dead went to Hades, and there they became mind-numbed zombies. Did not know you. I mean, I saw a movie about Hercules one time. He went to visit his departed wife and children, and they did not recognize each other and did not recognize him. Most of these ancient religions had very little to offer in the way of a happy afterlife. Now, what I want to emphasize here, what these religions had in common, what these civilizations had in common, for the most part, power was based on the ability of the ruler. Like I said last time, when I was in the Army, they taught us when you salute an officer, you're saluting the office he holds, not the man who holds the office, but to salute the office and honor the office, not the man necessarily behind the office. So you follow the office, not the officer. For the most part, they didn't have any kind of document we'd call a constitution. So whatever the king said was the law, that each new king made up his own law. Democracy was unknown among them. And I want to say this, folks, about democracy. You cannot have a democracy when the enemy nation is just on the other side of the hill. You climb the hill and look down, and there's the enemy. And they might strike you any time. Our own democracy was completely suspended during our Civil War. As meanwhile, you study yourself, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, suspended a lot of the Constitution, because the enemy was just on the other side of the Potomac River. They could see enemy territory looking out from the top of the Capitol building in Washington. So again, democracy was something you can't have. You have to meet an enemy threat when the enemy lives just across the river from you. You have to have a monarchy, purely and simply. Democracy was unknown. Rulers did depend heavily on their advisors. Now, folk, this was one reason why Adolf Hitler was able to have so much power. Adolf Hitler had the telephone, the radio, the airplane, and the train, and the tank. Before him, I mean, rulers, he'd sit in his palace, but he had to delegate. Now, you count such and such, you take this territory, you do this and so, you take that territory. Hitler and Stalin could govern by means of telephone instantaneously, know what was going on in their entire realm. And folk, you think they had it. In the future, a dictator who has access to the internet could have authority that we cannot imagine, to know instantly what every individual is doing and where every individual is located at all times. This may be coming upon us pretty fast. But they didn't have that. These civilizations would arise for a while and then fade. Rise and fade. That's one of the topics I've picked for a paper. What makes civilizations fall? They would start out as nomadic people. They'd overthrow a more advanced civilization, adopt the culture of the people they conquered. Then they would be conquered by other nomadic peoples. The uncivilized would conquer their civilized neighbors. These people were extremely religious. You don't find in the ancient world hardly any skeptics. Now, Confucius might have been one, Socrates, but they were rare. They were very religious. Among the kings, you hardly find, because the kings were expected to honor their gods, and he depended on his gods for his sustenance as king. Even though their favorite gods tended to change over time, they would quit worship, change their worship of one god to another. Sometimes it elevated a lower god to the highest position on the pantheon. They never seemed to doubt their validity of their religion. I mean, after all, when you say the river is God, one thing you know about the river, it does exist. Well, the sun is God. Well, the sun at least does exist. But their religion was oftentimes intertwined with magic, superstition, shamanism, temple prostitution, human sacrifice, and a lot of other undesirable elements. Superstition, a belief if I carry a rabbit's foot, I'll have good luck, or if I put a horseshoe on my doorpost, it'll bring me good luck. That you can gain favor with the gods by performing certain rituals. And I'll say this, don't follow it. Don't believe it. But anyway, that's up to you. Whatever you decide. I mean, mostly their religion had little to do with morals, with the Jews and Persians were exceptions. They had an ideal life for their followers to lead in this life. And oftentimes the ideal was measured how much can I acquire. So what I used to see on bumper stickers many years ago was, he who dies with the most toys wins. But then some other bumper stickers say, he who dies with the most toys is still dead. Or he who dies with the most toys wins nothing. And it was not a matter of morality. It was a matter of if I can get more, or if I can experience more of this life's happiness. Little was promised in the afterlife. It was all here and now. And folk, even among the Jews, this was no exception. Read the Jewish Old Testament and you'll find very little was said about the afterlife. It was all here and now. Indian religions were somewhat of an exception, but it might take thousands of years of cycles before you attained that happy afterlife. Otherwise, you just kept going and going around and around from one cycle to another. Eventually, you got higher and higher and higher, and maybe, if you didn't allow somewhere in one of your lives, you might attain nirvana, or eventually you would. Women were generally, they were stay-at-home moms, were not involved very politically. There were a few exceptions. Hatshepsut was a queen. Among the Jews, they had a judge named Deborah. Most of their art and music was religious in nature. Now, if you'd grown up in this time, you'd probably been born in a city. In a city, there'd be two prominent buildings. A palace where the king lived and a temple where the god lived. And the temple and the palace, sometimes they'd be in the center of the city, or sometimes on a prominent part of the edge. But most of your life would center around the city. or around the countryside near one. I mean, people that live in the countryside do have to grow the crops the city dwellers ate. So you would either live in a city or close to one. And some of your produce would be sent for the people who live inside the city to eat part of what you produced. All right. With that, I'll call it a day. Again, I've spent a whole lot less time on these two chapters than I normally would because of the nature of this course. You're expected to get it after. Now, about the test, I do have a social activities afternoon. Well, my son wants to celebrate my birthday, which is coming up Wednesday. So, yeah, I'll be 66, but I don't mind telling you. Anyway, so that's going to be done this afternoon. Well, I'm going to try my best, though, to get your grades posted on iCollege tomorrow. I simply am not going to promise it today, but tomorrow. The grades for both the pass and the real test. Okay. Oh, yes. And before we do, there's something I must say about the next test next week. Folks, those of you who are here, listen up. I want you to be able to look at a blank map like this. All right, this is the test next week. And I promised myself, and I'm going to announce it now, and be able to pick North America, South America. Okay, these are the places we're going to talk about this semester. Greece, Rome, India, China, South America, already mentioned. Italy, Arabia, Israel, Africa, and Rome. Now, don't try to do like one people did and said, this is Australia. I didn't ask for that. I couldn't even point. Now, these are the 10 things. Now, I want you to be able to put on the map the location of each of these. I mean, is that hard? Hopefully, I'll know this is North America. If you don't, I mean, this is South America. Now, as for where Israel is, big to learn between now and next week. This is the 10 points. 10 points each for each one. All right. Some of you are writing this down. Go ahead. But I almost forgot to give this to you. But that's next week's pass, the map skills. I'm amazed at how many college students do not even know where Africa is on the map. Well, folk, you should. And I'm amazed how many college students do not know where China is on the map. Now, I've been talking India and China today. I want you, India is a peninsula in southern Asia. China is at the corner of Southeast Asia. Hopefully you all can identify. Most of yes?
You just want us to know that Rome is the capital of Italy?
What I want you to do is point out where in the world is Rome. And where on this world map is Rome? If you get anywhere close, I'll try to write.
Okay.
No, don't put Rome down here. Like I've seen students do it. Don't put Rome over here. I mean, you know, put it where somewhere close to where it belongs.
Like on Italy?
Yeah, on Italy. Yeah, put it on Italy. Yes. Uh-huh. And Israel. I mean, you know, if you put Israel down there in China, I mean, like that. Yes.
Our test next week also include chapter 4 about Greece.
Yeah, we have this is the pass, and then the test next will not be about Greece. Test next week will be about India and China only. Now we start talking about Greece next week and Rome.
So it's just chapter 2?
Chapter 2 and 3. It's on the syllabus. Now make sure you look at chapter 2. The stuff I'm on today, chapter 2 and 3. I've not made up next week's test yet. I'm going to do that. I've told myself I'm going to wait until after I've given the lecture and then make up this week's test based a lot on what I said in class this last 2 hours. Yes, you want to? There'll be there's only 3 pass. This week, next week, and it's on the syllabus. Either we skip a week or it's a week after that, or I'll find out. And so I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you an answer to that right now. Right here. This is my syllabus. Thank you.
We also have a test that's on July 3rd, but the academic.
Yeah, the test is on July 3rd. If you can't make it, take it on July 10th.
Okay.
Yeah. I know, folks, July 3rd is a holiday, practically, but this school did not call class off. I mean, simply didn't. So, I mean, you know, I did not make up a schedule. Now, about the test, the pass. Pass 2 is June 12th. Pass 3 is June 26th. Okay, I'll have more to say about that in a couple weeks. Pass 3 is actually June 26th. Okay. All right, any other
You
questions?
have a copy of that in iCollege?
What's that? This is on iCollege. Yes, yes, indeed. I mean, I put that on the board last week. This is on iCollege. And you do need it. You do need it. Now, I had one of you tell me that this is the biggest syllabus I've ever seen. Over the years, I keep